Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you here again on this Friday here in Colorado. Nice and cool here in Colorado. I don't know what it's like in Minnesota, where my guest is from. My guest is Andy Naselli. He is the professor of systematic theology and New Testament at Bethlehem College and Seminary. I think I said the full lengthy title there correctly, Andy. But Andy, I've known for a little while now and always appreciated his thinking. If you go to his website, I mean, the dude is a machine. He's got all sorts of tips, tricks, hacks to how to put books on audio. He's just a reading machine. So he's come out with his book, How to Read a Book, which I think is right up his alley. Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure, Chase.
So you've been up at Bethlehem for how long now?
Just finishing year 11.
Year 11. And before that, where were you?
I was working full-time for D.A. Carson as his research manager, and we were finishing off a 5-year project, a study Bible. It's called the NIV Biblical Theology Study Bible. And before that, I was just his research assistant while a PhD student.
Okay. Were you at TEDS for that time, or where were you?
That's right. Yep.
And you got your PhD at TEDS?
My second one. Yep.
Second one. Okay. So which tell me about these PhDs. You got one at TEDS, and where's the other one?
The first one I got at Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina in theology. And then after that, I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for one in New Testament exegesis and theology to study with Don Carson.
Okay.
I actually dedicated this book to Don Carson.
I saw that. So when you got your PhD in theology at Bob Jones, was there a particular focus in theology that you were studying?
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of Keswick Theology?
Yeah.
It's spelled with a W, Keswick. And I analyzed that. I explained the history of it, explained what it is, and then evaluated it. And my thesis is that Keswick Theology is bad.
Yeah, agreed. I think I read your book on that. And now that I remember, it's a short book.
No quick fix, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah. I read it 5 years ago, and I just now connected the dots that you're the author of that book. That's great.
Here you go.
I was reading it because there's some Asian dude that's really popular, Chinese dude, and in kind of this holiness Keswickian theology, and I can't remember his name right now. So this is probably
I studied the first generation, so 1875 to 1920.
Okay.
There have been many people who've taken up that banner since then. I can guess who it might be, but I'm not sure.
Oh, it's Watchman Nee.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had some people in my church that were starting to read books by him, or like some of my friends from college. And I was like, this seems sus, and I can't put my finger on it. And then I had heard of Keswickian theology just because of my own pietistic background. And so I read your book and I was like, yes, good. And so that was really helpful during that time. Okay, so that was the focus there at Bob Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently that didn't satiate your appetite. You were a glutton for punishment and wanted more. What inspired you to go to TEDS?
The reason is that at the time, the PhD at Bob Jones was not regionally accredited. So in order to get a teaching post, you need a regionally accredited degree from most schools in America. So that's why I pursued a second one. And I wanted to study with D.A. Carson. At the time, he was, it's like studying under Scalia as a Supreme Court justice. Like, he was just the top New Testament scholar, and I want to learn what I can from him. And in the Lord's kind providence, doors opened for me to go there. I was one of 3 guys accepted into the New Testament program, and then he needed a new TA. So I started working for him right away, and we hit it off.
That's excellent. Yeah, his book Exegetical Fallacies was required reading, and that was great in seminary because it's so well done. It's just really helpful.
I just agreed. I haven't signed the contract yet, but I just agreed verbally to write the 3rd edition of that, co-authored, but I'll make all the changes and updates. So that's my next project.
That's great. Okay, and then you worked on the NIV.
No, not the NIV. The NIV Study Bible, Biblical Theology Study Bible. Yeah.
Okay. So help me, since you're very adept at logic. What is the why distinguish there? Why would you want to make sure you emphasize
working on the
that?
NIV would mean you're on the CBT, the Council for Biblical Translation, and I'm not one of the translators.
Gotcha.
I was simply overseeing a study Bible with that translation as the base.
Okay, that makes sense. I think it might be helpful, and this might be a good segue into the book itself. I get a lot of Christians that ask me, people of my church, Like we hand out new Bibles to new people who are exploring Christianity, and we've always used the ESV. The ESV was published. I think it was a revision of the RSV, but
Correct.
it's come out in the last 20, 30 years. I think Crossway
Hmm.
owns the copyright on that.
Hmm.
But growing up, it didn't exist. I always read the NIV, and then one of my mentors who went to DTS recommended the NASB, so I got
Hmm.
on that. And then I got into the whole Reformed resurgence, and the ESV was kind of like the thing. You got
Hmm.
to get the ESV. That's like what
Hmm.
everybody uses. I'm like, okay, I guess if everybody uses it. So maybe for those listeners who don't know, could you tell me a bit about Bible translation? Because after going to seminary, it's like, oh, wow, this is it's kind of a big deal. And I
Yeah,
think a lot of Christians don't really understand. So tell me more about kind of Bible translation, how we go from the Greek, the Hebrew, into modern English and what that looks like.
sure. I wrote a book called How to Understand and Apply the New Testament, 12 Steps from Exegesis to Theology. There's a chapter in there on Bible translation that goes into a lot more detail. I'll give you a real quick overview. Basically, there are two main ways to translate, two poles. One is to do a very form-based translation, and the other is to do a very meaning-based translation. So, for example, if you speak Spanish, you hear this often, ¿Cómo se llama? And we would say that means, what's your name? That's a meaning-based translation. A form-based translation, a very rigidly form-based translation, would be how yourself called, which is just terrible
Yeah.
way to communicate. No one is advocating for a form-based translation that's that bad. But the idea is there's a spectrum from more form-based to more meaning-based, and the translation philosophy of the NASB and the ESB, the Legacy Standard Bible, and others is more form-based, and the translation philosophy of the New Living Translation, for example, is more meaning-based. And then on that spectrum, about the middle, are translations like the NIV. The CSB would be in there as well. The Net Bible would be there. So that's a quick survey.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've found myself in the last few years going back to the King James or New King James. In fact, I had picked up a Geneva Bible because that's kind of in the area of my studies, because that's what many of them would have been using back in the day. And
Mm-hmm.
it's always been fascinating to kind of read those more, what some might call archaic,
Mm-hmm.
mainly because it's just written in that style of English back then. But I would be curious, a lot of people today kind of use very kind of loose translations, like the Message. That's very popular. Eugene Peterson is a very popular figure from many pastors. They think the ideal is to go fly fishing and live in Montana, which who can blame them? I mean, that sounds great. But he tends to lay out a vision of pastoral ministry, which very, very much coheres with that lifestyle. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on like a translation, like if we can even call it a translation. What do we think of the Message when we put it in that kind of framework?
That's not a translation. That's a paraphrase. So the New Living Translation is an actual translation. It revises the Living Bible, which Ken Taylor paraphrased. You just didn't know Greek or Hebrew. He's just reading the King James and he's paraphrasing it for his kids. Uh, so the Message, Eugene Peterson says he looks at the Greek and Hebrew as he does it, but it's not even close to a translation. It's very much a highly interpreted paraphrase. I would not call that the Bible. That doesn't mean it's meaningless or worthless.
Right,
It's just not a Bible.
right. That makes sense. Okay, so that gets us kind of into how to read a book because we're talking about Bible reading.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a very helpful book. I mean, just it's short. I've got a copy here for the audience. I'll put a link in the show notes for people who are watching or listening, so you can go pick one up. I believe it's out now. Is it still on pre-order, Andy, as we record this?
It is available from Amazon and Canon Press, and it's also available as an audiobook from Canon Press shortly from Audible. And it's
Okay,
on
great.
Kindle as well.
Excellent. So what, I guess, you've written many books before this. What inspired you at this time? You were like, it's 2024. This is a book that needs to be written. What was kind of the inspiration behind you writing this?
Well, I'm a professor, and part of my job, really the essence of my job, is teaching people how to read and then communicate. And so many students struggle with reading demanding theological treatises and to read volumes of it, lots of it, and they're just asking for help. So what I've done in my teaching career is teach students there are levels of reading. There are different ways you can approach it. Let me teach you that. And then my assignments require different levels to try to coach you through that. And I've found that when you help students, kind of take them by the hand and walk them through this, they love it, and it increases their skill and their enjoyment. So I figured, why not share this more broadly?
Yeah, it's great. And I'm glad you did because it helped me. I mean, one of the topics I want to talk about with you is, in seminary, I felt kind of a duty to read exhaustively. I don't think that's a category you use. I think you use macro or micro to describe the type of reading I was doing. But I felt that if I was going to read, if it was required reading, I had to read cover to cover. I had to understand it thoroughly, in detail. And you actually highlight this when you recommend an alternative type of reading called
Mm-hmm.
survey reading. And that always irked me, like people that would say I read 500 books a year or something like that. I'm like, that's ridiculous. How could you read? Reading doesn't mean surveying. So maybe for the listener, maybe explain those categories a little
Sure.
bit and let's talk about survey reading.
Yeah, and I don't keep track of the number of books I read because the number sounds inflated, and I just and then you can get proud and just. But so here are the three levels of reading that I recommend, and they build on each other. Think of it like a 3-level cake. Start at the bottom level, and that would be surveying, and then the next level would be macro reading, and then the top level would be micro reading. What you, Chase, thought was good reading was micro reading, meaning you read every word super carefully. You're zeroing in on it, making sure you're tracing the argument. You're maybe rereading some stuff, not missing a footnote. Just every word. So that's the most demanding reading. That's the most careful reading. And for the very best books, we want to read them that way. We want to get everything out of them we can if they're really, really good. But most books don't merit that kind of reading. So I tell students this, that it just shocks them. I read sometimes hundreds of books a week. And like, what? And it's only in this sense. So I've been the administrator of a theological journal called Themelios for since 2008. So I have access to several databases of forthcoming books, and regularly, weekly, I will go through hundreds of books of what's coming out in the next few months. I do it weekly, every week. So I'm listening, what's next? And I work with about 100 publishers, and then I choose from that list books that I think we might want to review. I'm probably averaging 10 books a day of new books coming in. And then from that, I cull, okay, here's what I think we might want to consider reviewing with this journal. And then I select those and share them with editors, and we work with that. So just I'm able to look at a book in a matter of less than a minute, sometimes less than 30 seconds, and size it up. I look at the author, the title, endorsements, publisher. I get a sense real quickly of what's this book about? Would this be something that would interest me and other theology guys? That's a skill that comes over years and years and years of working with books. So I can pick up a book and size it up. That's the fastest kind. But I also can survey a 500-page book in 10 minutes. I mean, that might be involving, what's the argument? What's the backbone? What's the skeletal structure? I want to x-ray this book. What's its thesis? What are its supporting arguments? What's it concluding? Which means I'm looking at, if it's a good table of contents, I look there. If they have an intro or conclusion that summarizes the book, I look there. What's this thing about? You can do that quickly. And a lot of students, a lot of people assume if I read a book, I have to read every word. And one of my most enjoyable tasks as I teach about reading is to tell people, be free. Like, your conscience does not need to weigh you down here. Educate your conscience, calibrate your conscience, train your conscience to tell you, I don't have to read every word of a book once I start it. A lot of books are not worth your time. So my attitude towards a book, it sounds kind of hoity-toity, but it's like this. There are trillions of books out there. Why should I give you my time when I have such a limited time? All right, here's 30 seconds, go.
Right.
And occasionally, not normally, but occasionally, a book surprises me. It draws me in. And before I know it, I've been looking at this book for 10, 15, 30 minutes. And I'm like, okay, this is going on my reading list. I want to at least macro read this,
Yeah.
which means I read every word, sometimes by an audiobook. Sometimes it's more like if you're driving down a freeway and you're going 60, then you drop down to 30 because the traffic's getting a little congested. Then it's rolling at like 3 or 5, and then back up to 60. Sometimes reading a book is like that. You're going fast, and then, oh, this looks really important. Oh, this is really interesting. You slow down. So there's different speeds, different levels to read, and this is revolutionary to students when they first hear it. But then there are other personalities like John Piper, the chancellor of my school, who has one speed for reading, which is very slow and thorough, and he appreciates what I'm doing, but it doesn't work for him. So I want to recognize it's not for everyone, but I found it works for most people.
Yeah, I think it's been really helpful. I wish I had known about this back when I started seminary, because I think I could have been more effective. I mean, the benefit of reading slow, I guess, is that you really immerse yourself in the ideas of authors, even if you disagree with them, and you have to understand the arguments. And so I always joke, because at Denver Seminary, egalitarianism is kind of like a thing, like a big thing, and like if you're complementarian, or God forbid patriarchal, you're kind of maligned. And so, I had the luxury or the punishment, if you want to put it that way, of like studying the egalitarian arguments thoroughly. And so when I'm in Boulder and I deal with feminism and egalitarianism, it's like, I know the arguments. I'm very familiar with this kind of thing, but it does limit you in terms of your ability to engage broadly and select discerningly. And I think this is where a lot of people get tripped up. Why don't we, for the listener, we already talked about Bible translation, but maybe talk about how, okay, if that's how we approach literature, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or anything like that, how should we approach the Bible, and how should we approach it differently? Because as a pastor, I wouldn't say we should survey the Bible. I mean, there's surveys of the Bible. There's ways to understand the meta themes of the Bible and that kind of thing. But how should we apprehend the Bible maybe differently than just any other book?
So in the book, after I introduce and explain surveying, I qualified at the end by saying there are at least 3 situations in life where you can't just survey. One is Bible reading. You got to read every word carefully. And I can come back to that. Number 2 would be if you're a student and a professor assigns a text to read in a certain way. You can't honestly fulfill that obligation without reading every word. And then 3rd, there are some books that you need for your vocation that might just be boring, and you just got to plod through it to gain skill and credibility. But back to the Bible reading, I'd say there are 2 levels at which you can read the Bible: macro reading and micro reading. And I don't say you shouldn't survey it. Like, it might be worthwhile to sit down, like with the Gospel of Matthew, which is about a 3-hour book, and survey it in such that in a way that you get the structure. So you see, there are these 5 discourses with the same wording that concludes each of them, and then you got the intro and conclusion. Like, that kind of thing is really helpful. But what I mean is, you don't want to only survey the Bible. You want to take in every word. I take in the Bible every morning by macro reading it. What I do is I wake up, and the first thing I do is I pull up my phone and pull up an app that reads the Bible to me. And I just pick up where I left off the day before. So I listen to the Bible every morning as I'm waking up, as I'm getting ready for the day. So that's macro reading. It's every word, but it's clipping. Now, when I listen to an audiobook or a podcast, I speed them up. For the Bible, I don't go beyond 1.2. And for Proverbs, I got to stay at 1. You can't go too fast for Proverbs. But what I've found, and I've been doing this for years, is taking the Bible in that way is so good. It's like if you're dirty and then you just stand in a rushing stream where it's just pouring over you and it's cleansing you. Now, you're going to miss stuff, but you're getting so much benefit from it. And you're surveying, that's the wrong verb. You're working through the Bible regularly in big chunks. And what that does is it helps me as a teacher and a pastor and professor to have the whole Bible right there in my RAM, my random access memory, accessible all the time. And in addition to that kind of reading, I'm also regularly micro reading it. So it's not either or, it's both. But part of that is my profession. I'm a full-time professor and I'm a pastor. So I'm always in the Word, studying, looking at the Greek and the Hebrew and theology. So that's my micro reading. And the daily rhythm of taking in the Bible devotionally is macro reading.
Okay, and you said you wanted to pull maybe a thread about how we read the Bible and how we come to it.
Right. So that's what I was talking about, the difference between micro and macro reading the Bible.
Okay.
So for you, before I started doing this, I would every morning sit down at a desk early in the morning and read a print Bible, and that was great. That's fantastic. But it was so slow for me because the way my brain works is if I read a phrase, I don't understand it, I can't just keep going. I have to stop and figure out what that is. And then it's like, oh, how's that relate to this passage over here? And before I know it, I'm in this deep Bible study and I didn't even finish half a chapter, which is great. That's not bad. But my point is, in order to let the Word of God in vast quantities pour over you, uh, macro reading is so valuable. There's a reason historically in churches they read the Bible aloud. They just read it. You can't say, "Hey, can you stop a second? I've got a question." No, it keeps coming over you. So I think there's a good place for taking in the Bible at a clip that you can't pause it and stop it.
Right.
But that's not in place of studying.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing, and it actually connects to work you've done on Keswick theology. And I make this joke, and it's not meant to denigrate Bible reading or anything like that, but the kind of like the way I've approached the Christian life was very like what you described. Before we had kids, I would wake up before I went to the construction site. I'd wake up at 6 a.m. I'd make some coffee. Back then, I had time to make French press coffee every morning, and I would pour the French press, and I would sit with the ESV study Bible, and I would spend 30 minutes reading the Bible, praying, and then we had kids, and I went to seminary and planting a church, and my life became insanely busy, and that luxury of doing that was it felt robbed from me. And I always joke that I feel like because of my pietistic background, I became a worse Christian
Hmm.
once I had
Hmm.
kids and got married. Because when you're single, you have all this time to study the Bible and do what good Christians do and pray. Uh, I've wrestled with that tension. I've found resolution, so I'm not asking you to help me find resolution, but I sense that I'm probably not the only one that's had that experience,
Hmm.
and I'm wondering how you might help somebody who's struggling with that reality.
Yeah, well, one thing that comes to mind is there's a false sense of spirituality when you're not being tested, pressured. So you might think you're a very patient person until you have kids, that kind of thing. So in this case, it may have been a false sense of spiritual maturity when there just weren't the pressures to test you as you had that time alone. But on the other hand, I don't like it when people basically give a pass to like a young mom, say, "Oh, you're just busy. You don't need to read the Bible." That's horrible. That's the one thing they need to sustain them. The question is, how can they take it in a way that fits with this crazy hectic schedule? My wife has a section. I actually quoted her in my book. When she read it, she made this comment, and I included it in the book, saying, "Busy moms don't get a pass here. There are all kinds of ways you can still take in the Bible. Maybe it's through an audio Bible while you're nursing. Maybe you have one of your kids who's able to read aloud while you're eating. Or there's so many ways you can be creative and take in the Bible. The question is, are you going to prioritize that over all the other things that can fill your time? Like, everyone likes to knock social media here, but it really is
Sure.
a time stealer. Are you
Yeah.
going to prioritize that and your text messages and your email and your phone calls over hearing from God? So there's a way to prioritize this even in a very busy schedule.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just, one of the things that was fascinating to me studying the history of Bible translation, how we got the New Testament, all this kind of stuff is, and the early church is often used as kind of this Trojan horse to shuttle in actually a lot of liberal theology in my mind as I've seen it, but you can learn a lot from the early church. And one of the things that fascinated me was kind of the canon was not necessarily complete, and most of the kind of understanding of uh, like you talked about in worship services, most of how people apprehended the Bible was very like verbal, like hearing it, like audiobook back then, because they didn't have mass produced Gutenberg press Bibles for everyone. So even the devotional life of Christians in the early church, whereas in like kind of the modern evangelical church, the norm we expect to have a copy of the Bible, which is good, and be reading it daily, which is good. But I think for many people, it seems that we've just assumed that's like Christian tradition in like the normative sense since Jesus ascended, which we just celebrated yesterday as we're recording this. That's been like the norm. Everyone had a Bible. Everybody's reading it every day. Can you talk a little bit about that as someone who's been part of, very deep study on and good work on exegesis and canon and all that kind of stuff?
I did a tally recently of all the Bibles I own. I forget the exact numbers, but I said them in a sermon, and it was crazy. It was like 200 English Bibles, like 100 Greek, New Testament, Hebrew, Old Testaments, then like another several dozen other translations like Latin and German and Spanish, and then a bunch of print Bibles. A lot of them are electronic, and then a bunch of audio Bibles. If you add it up, then that's one person. I mean, there are other people in my family too. That's crazy. In the history of the world, if you had a Bible,
right,
you were rich.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. One difference, I think, between those situations is we are not an oral culture like the first century. Many of the young men were memorizing large portions of scripture, and that was just baked into the Jewish culture, was memorizing large portions of scripture. Very few Christians in my context do that.
Yeah.
It's why would I memorize it? I have it. It's all right here. So there's actually, just because we have the Bible doesn't mean we know it better than people who didn't have a Bible before and only heard it read. If you're able to memorize it, meditate on it, and hear it read regularly, you can know it pretty well. And when Paul's writing his letters and he's referring to Old Testament passages, I think that the Old Testament informed audiences caught a lot more allusions and references than we think.
Yeah, I agree. And it's one thing I've encouraged Christians, like we want to know the Bible so well that we speak Bible. Like
Mm-hmm.
the very words that we use are Bible verses,
Mm-hmm.
and just the way that we talk,
Mm-hmm.
the way that we exhort one another. This is why I'm so cautious with new concepts and new theological terminology. It's like, let's just speak Bible. Let's say Bible verses over one another, encourage one another. That, of course, can be twisted. False teachers can do that and all that kind of stuff. But I just think it'd lead to a richer culture, family life, devotional life, if that was kind of like the way we envision our life was. Man, we just know the Bible so well that it just oozes out of us. It's just like that ram you talked about. Um, one thing that comes up with reading the Bible and studying books is making time. And we've kind of talked about this already, but just for personal application for me, one thing I struggle with is like, I saw you mention in your list of books, I think it was 40 books.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw you put Father Hunger on there, which has been a very helpful book for me as a dad. Really explained a lot about my own story as well. Just very helpful. But on the one hand, I really want to be a good dad. On the other hand, I really want to read books. And so when I'm reading books at home and I've got my kids coming up to me wanting to play or something like that, I typically will just put the book aside, but then I feel bad because I can't actually do the reading I need to do. So I want to know how Andy structures his time to make sure he can read, because right now my kids are staying up till 10 p.m. and, they wake up at 7 a.m. And it's like, if I'm home, it's hard for me, even when I'm recording my podcast, if my kids come up to the door here and like, Dad, I need something. I feel this existential, like, oh no, is this the choice? Is this where I'm going to be a bad dad? So talk me through that, Andy.
What my wife, Jenny, and I have worked through over the years might be helpful to you here. So this is our 20th year of marriage. We celebrate 20 years in July. And given our personalities, this is what has worked for us. We share an electronic calendar. We use Google Calendar, and we have various different sub calendars within it that we can see each other's basic appointments and rhythms. And we talk about this weekly if we need to adjust things. But the gist is from 5 p.m. to early evening, I'm with the family. So it's dinner, family time. That's 7 days a week, unless we're meeting with someone else in their home or in our home, or if I have an elder meeting. But for the most part, it's every night. That's the rhythm. Now, On weekends, Saturday, first half of Saturdays, it's daddy-daughter time. Gives my wife a break. Sundays, I take off work, so I'm very relaxed with the family. But the rest of the time, so Monday to Friday and Saturday afternoons usually, is time where I am doing work. I'm working hard, and they know that. But what helps my wife and my kids during those times is knowing that, oh, we get daddy time. It's coming. It's coming every day, and it's coming in bigger chunks in the weekend. And that's just part of the rhythm where they know he's not neglecting us. He's working hard to take care of us, and then he's with us all in. So I'm not mixing work and play. Now, of course, I work at home usually like you do, when I'm not teaching downtown at Bethlehem College and Seminary. And when I'm home, if there's a crisis, I'm here to help. My wife homeschools some of the girls, and sometimes they get stuck on something and they come to me, or there's a discipline issue, and I'm there for that kind of stuff. So it's not like I'm completely unavailable. But they just know that we have these rhythms and these times a day, days a week, where they can expect I'm working versus I'm yours. Does that help a little bit?
That does help. I mean, like in those times when you're working, I guess as a dad, like your kids understand, hey, I'm working, I can't help you right now. That's a totally appropriate response for you to give. Like that doesn't that's not a problem, right?
Unless they need me. So I have a wife who's home.
My kids always need me, Andy.
The thing is, during the daytime like that, typically they can go to mom, and I'm if mom can't solve it, let's go to dad. Maybe like a tough discipline situation or something like that. Or so that works out well. It helps that I have a very competent, gifted wife.
Yeah, I do too. Just to be clear,
I wasn't suggesting that. I don't know your
wife. I think one of the tensions in ministry, and maybe this won't relate to many listeners, but one of the things that's interesting as a pastor is like, and I'll joke about this with Kim, it's like sometimes it seems like it might be easier, one, if we didn't have cell phones, because there would be more like boundaries in terms of like accessibility and me being able to deep dive. And that's discipline on my part. That's something I have to own. But also just like interruptions throughout the day. And two, if I wouldn't work for like Megacorp down the road, and it was like, no, I actually go to work at a place, I am unavailable, and then I have to clock in and clock out. It's like that rigidity, that boundary. It's like I kind of envy that sometimes, where I don't think in a sinful way, but more just ideation, where it's like that seems so luxurious in terms of, as a pastor, your time is not as it's not as tangible what we produce. It's not as like there's not a product at the end of the day. Whereas when I worked in construction, I was like, this is just what we're doing. This is the project. These are the assignments. This is what I have to do today. And so I think that's a tension. I don't know if that's just me and my ministry and habits I've formed, but do you sense that tension for a lot of pastors or no?
Oh, for sure. And what I like to tell the guys I'm training to be pastors is it's not devious. It's not sinister to put on your calendar as an appointment studying, reading and studying. So if someone says, hey, can we meet on Friday at 9 a.m.? And I look at my calendar, oh, that's blocked off for research and writing. I say, no, I have an appointment then, but this time it's free with this work. That's not lying. You're treating it as I'm working then. I've blocked that time off. So treat that time carefully. So turn off all notifications. Like right now, as I'm talking to you, I haven't seen you check your phone for text messages. But if we weren't doing this podcast, I'm guessing that you may have done that once or twice in the last 30 minutes.
Right.
So you have the discipline in some circumstances to stop checking your phone like you're doing in this conversation. Right. I'm saying extend that discipline to other areas, like a reading session.
Yeah, that's great. So then I know we're deviating from the topic of the podcast, but
I feel like I'm counseling Chase Davis.
little do you know, that's why I have a podcast, so that you can do this. And sometimes it's helpful for other people. The last one on this topic is, okay, so in Andy's kind of schedule, because you're very effective, one of the things is like, you're a pastor too. How much time do you allot per week? I mean, you got multiple hats you're wearing. You're a professor, you're a pastor. How much time do you allot for those times of reading?
Oh, I'm a research professor as well, which means there's more of an obligation to be reading and writing. which I love. I'd be doing that anyway. So I don't have an hour to give you, but typically probably 3 days a week, 3 8-hour chunks I
Okay.
devote to solid study. It may be just reading, or it could be writing plus reading. So if I'm preparing to write a book or an article, you don't just sit down and start typing. You have to have something to say.
Right.
So sometimes that means before you write a book, you carefully read 40 books to make sure you have something to say. Then you start doing more of the research and as you type. So sometimes if you were just to have a video monitor, what's Andy doing now? It looks real boring. He's just poring over a book.
Yeah.
It's like, do something. And some people don't get it. That is work. It's actually, I think it's more demanding to be all in engaged intellectually in a demanding book than it is to do something that's also very good, like build a shed.
Yeah.
They're both good things to do.
Yeah.
But people assume, well, yeah, there's the shed. What'd you get done? I don't see anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that can be hard to, because I've always joked in the kingdom to come, I just want to dig ditches or mow lawns because like I feel like it's so like rewarding. Like at the end of the day, you're like, I did something, I can see it. And oftentimes the work we do intellectually is not that way. Let's get back to kind of some of the book itself. Um, One topic you bring up is authorial intent. This
Mm-hmm.
this applies to both Bible reading
Mm-hmm.
and it applies to reading any book. And
Right.
one of the things I wrestle with sometimes in reading a book is, like you said, when you survey read, you look at the author, you look at the publisher, you look at who endorsed it, and you just kind of go, I kind of know the approach, I know the angle. And so I feel like there can be some danger in that, and that you maybe will dismiss an idea before you've given it consideration. But in kind of our day, it's very popular to assume motive, to assume this stuff. This happens to me all the time when I share articles on social media. I've
Mm-hmm.
heard this from people, well, he said this, that means that. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
no, that's not how you read. And so
Mm-hmm.
talk to me about authorial intent and why that's such an important reality that people need to understand.
It's the golden rule. You want to interpret people the way you want them to interpret you. So if someone were to pull up your emails or your text messages and rip something out of context that you said, that means something clearly you didn't intend to say. We'd say that's bad faith, or they're just incompetent. That's not good reading. We just want to do the same to other people. So a good goal is, if you're critiquing someone, if they were in the room listening to you, or they read what you're writing, they would be able to say, yes, you accurately represented what I think. Now, we may disagree about whether you're right or not, but that's just baseline, is that you can accurately represent what someone else said. So that means that the goal of reading the Bible is, am I understanding what the author intended here?
Hmm.
So here's an example. I just prepared a sermon on Matthew 4, 1-11, which is when Satan tempts Jesus 3 times in the wilderness. Most sermons I've heard on that passage make it all about how believers should resist temptation. It is written, it is written, it is written. Quote the Bible, read the Bible, obey the Bible. When temptations come, here's how you deflect them. And as I study that, I realize that's just not the point of the passage. The point of the passage is Jesus, the Messiah, is here. He's on a mission to save his people from their sins. And he's the king. He's been announced, anointed, commissioned. And here's the test. Here's our champion, battle tested. Is he going to come through? Is he going to deviate from the mission? He doesn't. He comes through, sterling, standing, doesn't deviate. He's on mission. What a savior. This passage is about Jesus. It's not about you. So that's what I'm talking about, is when you read something, what did the author intend to communicate? That's what we want to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really challenging. One of the things that comes up with, at least in evangelicalism, is you've got so many publishers publishing so many books, and I think I woke up to this a little bit in 2020, where I was formerly part of the Acts 29 network, and there were a lot of books being promoted there, and I have a whole shelf dedicated to that effort. They were like promoting all these books about Black history and understanding the Black imagination and W.E.B. Du Bois and all this kind of stuff. And I got through half of them, And I was like, I feel like I'm reading the same book, and I don't agree with what they're saying in these books, but I'm being told that in order to be a good person, I have to read these books. The same thing came up in the church where, if you really want to understand race, you have to read, The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. And I'm like, I don't want to read that book. I don't trust that author. And people are like, why are you just dismissing people? So help me wrestle with that tension. Like, how do you counsel someone or pastor someone through kind of like understanding why you would do that?
Well, I don't know enough about this situation to know if you did the right thing or not.
Sure.
Did you adequately understand the wrong views that were permeating what you were reading, or did you just not like that it was challenging what you thought? And Mike, I know you well enough to know that you don't have a problem reading something you disagree with, but if you smell a rat, if you sense there's a snake behind it, you put up a guard. I don't
Right.
call that wisdom.
Sure.
So if I look at a book and it's endorsed by David French and Russ Moore, like I already know this is a bad book.
Sure.
Like today, if they endorse it today,
Right.
10 years ago it'd be different. But like
Yeah.
today, I don't trust those guys theologically or politically. So I already know I'm probably not going to like this book. Now, you might say you're judging a book, you're discounting the book prematurely.
Sure.
I would say maybe, but if those guys read the book and they mean what they say, probably not. So that's why there's wisdom in over the years developing trust with people who you can, when they commend a book, when they commend an article, okay, I probably should give this attention because he says it's good. We can't, if it's just you and you have to evaluate everything yourself,
Yeah.
life's too short. You can't read everything like that.
Totally.
And if you have dozens of friends with expertises in different areas helping you out, it's divide and conquer. So that's why we've got these friend networks that help us recommend things to read. So that's a lot of value there.
Yeah. And yeah, that's just been something to wrestle with, especially because like in Boulder, I'll debate atheists or get into evangelistic conversations with agnostics and atheists. And they're like, well, have you read Sam Harris's book? And I'm like, no. And I could go buy one and I could do the survey method and then say yes, but just in a clear cut, I don't own that book. I've never looked into Richard Dawkins' books. I know some of the arguments that are going to be in there, like, well, until you read that book, we can't even have a conversation. And it's like,
that's not true. John Piper makes this point all the time: is if you know your Bible really well, you're able to talk into anything.
Yeah.
So you don't have to read all the books to have an opinion. That's good. On the other hand, if like me, you're a research professor and you're going to take an academic approach to a topic, you really do need to know the other side, like you did with egalitarianism.
Right. Okay, cool. Last thing I want to talk about is kind of this concept that's very popular. Sometimes they'll call it plundering the Egyptians. Sometimes they'll call it eat the meat, spit out the bones. I don't know if you've ever heard the quip Driscoll had about that. Have you ever heard Driscoll's quip about eat the meat, spit out the bones?
No, I just know he said, "How dare you?"
Yeah,
right.
Right.
That was a Greta Thunberg. Never mind. Go ahead.
Nice. No, he would say, yeah, I could probably find M&Ms in a pile of poop, but I'd rather get them from the bag.
Okay.
And so that was what he was known for saying that back in the day. But kind of this eat the meat, spit out the bones. It's like, yeah, but what if the meat's poison, or what if like people? Because I want to embody what you talked about with the golden rule, and I want to read charitably, and yet at the same time, it's kind of like, yeah, but like, why would I go read a 400-page book and try to just find one thing good for the sake of finding one thing good when I could read a 200-page book, like How to Read a Book, and I could like, it's pretty much all good. It's good for me. Like
pretty much.
Pretty much. I mean, I'm sure I would find some things I disagree with in here. I highlighted in,
right.
What'd you say? You put an X by things you disagree with?
I do. Yeah.
You know what I do when I read is I just put no by things I disagree with.
With an exclamation point.
But what do you make of this concept, eat the meat, spit out the bones, kind of plundering the Egyptians, this kind of stuff, when people approach topics like critical race theory or other things like that?
So on the one hand, the concept is valid. It comes from Augustine, at least. Recognizing that you can read ancient works, the great books, and benefit from them, even if you don't share the same worldview and you don't reach the same conclusions. So our school, Bethlehem College, focuses on reading great books for this very reason. You're reading Plato and Aristotle, and you don't have to agree with them all across the line to benefit from them. So I think this is most valuable when it's for great books, meaning books that they've stood the test of centuries, and it's a conversation. You're entering a conversation that's bigger than you, and it's not like the book that came out in the last 10 minutes. So I think that's what your concern is. It's for the most recent stuff that comes out. If it's a recent book, it's got to be really good if I'm going to give it some time.
Right.
So I would prioritize the best stuff that's been tested over centuries over new stuff. And if you're going to read new stuff, make sure it's worth your time. Now, you might have a reason to read poisonous stuff today, like if you're a research professor or you're a pastor and you want to warn people about an error.
Yeah.
But as a general rule, life is too short to be reading junk. So eat the meat to spit out the bones for new stuff. I would not, as a general rule, recommend. Right. And when critical theory was in its heyday in our circles, like in 2019, 2021, I was regularly saying to students and church members, we don't want to take that approach here because the meat itself is injected with poison.
Right.
This is bad. Stay away from this. So I don't recommend that approach for something like critical theory.
Yeah. And, kind of rounding out the episode, I think one thing you talked about is that it's important to know who to trust. And I think trust is at an all-time, not all-time would be an exaggeration. It's very hard to come by nowadays. Who can I trust? Who can I listen to? Especially if you're a listener, you know my story. Just like, there's a lot of people who I trusted who I may not trust anymore. There's a lot of people who I thought I didn't trust, but actually turned out to be good guides. And of course, all of this is under God's providence and sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And it should humanize people in a way where we don't idolize them. But maybe kind of talk to the listener about how do we find people, or how do we know how to trust appropriately the right people? How has that either happened for you, or how have you learned to do that well?
It happens over the years. You gain experience and wisdom, and you continually course correct. In 2008, I was working full-time for D.A. Carson, and I was taking minutes at the Gospel Coalition meetings, and I was so excited to be part of that. I would have never dreamed that 15 years later, I wouldn't be as excited doing something like that. What happened? I don't think I changed that much. I have changed a little bit, but the world has changed drastically, and people have changed how they align on those various issues. And there's been a resortment. And it's funny, I'll look at a book from 2009 or 12, and it's endorsed by like 5 or 8 people who would never all endorse the same book today.
Right. Yeah.
Something majorly happened. Kevin Young put his finger on this in his article in 2021, I think it was, on the fracturing, the splintering of Reformed evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. And that's just a reality. So you take things like that into account when it comes to who you trust.
Yeah, and I think a lesson for all of us is like it should be humbling. I mean, it's the lack of unity, the lack of trust. It should turn us back to who we can trust, ultimately the Lord, and hopefully your local pastor. And so there should be a great sense of humility and repentance amongst all people, particularly Christians who know the Lord. And there should be an appraisal of humanity in which we don't idolize, which has been something I've had to repent of, in terms of different thought leaders. So, well, this was a great conversation. I appreciate the personal counseling you provided with me on the episode. So we've got How to Read a Book, Andy Naselli. Where can we pick it up again? Amazon, Canon, where else?
I don't know. That's great.
Okay, great. And then do you have any places you want to plug, your website, social media, anything like that?
AndyNaselli.com, on X, Andy Naselli. There you go.
Perfect. That's great. I'll put a link to those in the show notes for you listeners. And for those on YouTube who are listening, you can go check those out in the description below. Thanks so much for tuning in to Foolproof Theology. If you are loving this content, I'd love if you give it a great rating, share it with anyone you know. I think it's going to be a very helpful episode for many people. And also there's a link to the Patreon in the show notes. You can go sign up there for early access to every episode I record. Sign up there at $15 a month. You get swag. You can get early access. You can get direct comments to me, recommend authors or anything like that. So go sign up on the Patreon, support the show, and we'll see you next time.